The National Desk, America's News, now.
This week on the National Desk, closing argument.
I appeal to all Americans, regardless of party, to meet this moment of national and generational importance.
The president pleading with voters ahead of the midterms. Why he says democracy is on the ballot next week. Plus,
restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive stance of policy for some time.
No end in sight. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates again. How everyday life will be impacted. What needs to happen to slow inflation, and are more hikes on the way? Then, an early surge of RSV, sending children to emergency rooms, overwhelming hospitals across the country.
We're seeing about a 300% increase in RSV cases, and we don't even know if we peaked yet.
Where maxed out medical centers force leaders to issue a state of emergency. This is the National Desk, America's News Now. Thanks for being with us. I'm Dee Dee Gatton. On this weekend's edition, we take a look at the big headlines of the week and a look ahead at what to expect, starting with the 4 big stories we've been following all week. Just days away from midterm elections, President Biden issuing a dire warning about threats against U.S. democracy. Recent polls showing several races are running on razor-thin margins across battleground states. The Federal Reserve issuing another massive interest rate hike to ramp down runaway inflation. Health officials sounding alarms about a rise in seasonal respiratory virus infections, putting a pinch on pediatric hospitals and a dangerously low supply of diesel, impacting everyday Americans in unexpected ways. President Biden warning this week voting for election deniers in the upcoming midterms is, quote, a path to chaos in America.
Is trying to succeed where they failed in 2020, to suppress the right of voters and subvert the electoral system itself. That means denying your right to vote and deciding whether your vote even counts.
President Biden took aim again at ultra-MAGA Republicans, saying they represent a minority of the Republican Party, but threaten democracy's foundations and fuel political violence. He also says there are candidates running for every level of office who will not commit to accepting the results of their election. He called this political moment, quote, unprecedented, unlawful, and un-American. Just days away from midterm elections, control of the U.S. Senate will come down to some tight races. The National Desk chief political correspondent Scott Thuman takes us beyond the podium and walks us through the toughest battlegrounds.
How much of a nail-biter could election night be? Well, look at the maps. All seats in the House of Representatives up for grabs. That's 435. But there are roughly 24 within these states that we've highlighted in yellow that we think could be central in the fight over party control. And then over in the Senate, 35 races, a dozen or so that'll make or break the night. So let's look at the most high-profile ones underway right now. Between, for example, in Georgia, Senator Raphael Warnock and the former football player Herschel Walker. According to the data crunchers over at 538, Democrat Warnock up 49.3 over 49.2 for Walker of the projected vote share. And then in Nevada, let's go west and look at this race. Republican challenger Adam Laxalt, he's actually leading the incumbent Democrat Senator Catherine Cortez Masto by just under 1%. Republicans optimistic this is a seat they can flip. And then Pennsylvania, Democrat Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, he's up 1 percentage point over Republican challenger Mehmet Oz. We were just there days ago talking with people from all sides who say frustration with Washington is driving votes both ways. Are you happy with the options you have this year in the Senate?
Not really. Politics totally for the last couple of years is crappy.
And there's a lot of dead meat down there.
Do you think that Washington is fixable?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you get the right crew in there as president on down, yeah, it can be fixed.
A new ABC poll shows half of voters listed either the economy or inflation as their top issue. And even though a lot of analysts say Republicans have the momentum, it is still not exactly a clear view as to who will control Congress once the night wraps up. And here's your current balance of power. It's 50-50 in the Senate. Democrats technically with control because they have Vice President Harris as a tiebreaker. So Republicans need a net gain of just 1 seat there to take the gavel. And then over on the House side, Republicans need a net gain of 5 to flip that chamber. We're going to have complete election coverage for you leading up to and after all the votes are counted. In Washington, Scott Thuman for the National Desk.
Scott, thank you. Here's a look over Capitol Hill, where new details are coming out in the break-in at House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's house. The Washington Post reports Capitol Police cameras caught the breaking in on camera, but no officers were watching. David DePape, the man accused of attacking Pelosi's husband with a hammer, pleaded not guilty to all charges. DePape appearing before a judge Tuesday, where he was ordered to be held without bail until a preliminary hearing set for November 4th. According to court documents, DePape told police he was on a suicide mission, but was willing to risk his life to combat the, quote, level of lies coming out of Washington, D.C. He's facing multiple charges, including assault, attempted murder, and attempted kidnapping.
You have threats of harassment, intimidation, and violence.
Days away from the midterms, the federal government is warning of a, quote, complex threat environment. While saying there's no information about credible threats, election leaders and law enforcement nationwide are on alert. As some head to the polls, scenes like this are imprinted in memory.
You had the January 6th event. Now we're concerned that it may happen again.
Cybersecurity expert Dr. Scott White believes the attack on the U.S. Capitol was an act of domestic terrorism. He says that movement is still active throughout the U.S.
And I think one of the things that we deal with today is there's so much rhetoric, there's so much whether it be anti-government or anti-political party, or even anti-individual in the case of Chair Pelosi, that individual predominantly on the fringe, and many of them with mental health issues, may act out violently.
Recently, a top U.S. cybersecurity official warned of an environment involving everything from cyber threats to threats of harassment, intimidation, and violence. She said they're putting out warnings to make sure state and local election staff have what they need to protect their voting systems. Security is top of mind at the local level, according to Mecklenburg County Election Director Michael Dickerson.
We always talk about your safety and security. We've encouraged that this year a little bit more so that people realize we're here to protect and we're here to keep you safe.
Recently, people who were armed and in tactical gear were seen outside a ballot drop box in Arizona. In Texas, there have been reports of intimidation of election workers. And in Wisconsin, reports of social media threats.
This is very disconcerting, and law enforcement has to move on it very quickly.
And in some locations, we're told there will be plainclothes officers if anyone feels uncomfortable. Dr. White underscores the need for measures like this because as we hear of intimidation, he says people could become fearful and not vote.
We still have some ways to go.
That's Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell explaining what Americans should expect over the long haul regarding future interest rate increases. This week, the Fed announced its fourth consecutive interest rate hike of 75 basis points, its sixth rate adjustment of the year. But Powell says the recent CPI and labor reports have changed the bank's strategy.
Both the strong labor market report, but particularly the CPI report, do suggest to me that we may ultimately move to higher levels than we thought at the time of the September meeting. That level is very uncertain, though, and I would say, we're going to find it over time.
Meantime, new polling shows 2/3 of registered voters believe the U.S. economy is already in a recession. A Politico Morning Consult survey found 65% of respondents say we are currently in a recession. 22% say we aren't there yet, and 14% did not know or didn't have an opinion. Finance company Fannie Mae's latest forecast reports the housing market will tip the U.S. into a recession in early 2023. Orange County, California, under a health emergency. Officials say rapidly spreading viral infections are overwhelming hospitals. The emergency declaration allows the county to use state and federal resources to get a handle on the situation. Right now, a perfect storm of COVID-19, the flu, and RSV is behind similar scenes playing out at medical facilities coast to coast.
Emergency rooms really across the region and across the country are running anywhere from 50 to 100% greater in terms of the number of encounters.
Doctors are encouraging everyone to stay up to date with their vaccinations to help reduce the strain on healthcare workers. U.S. Capitol Police report a record 9,600 violent threats against politicians have been made in the last year. It highlights a disturbing increase in political violence. The fact-check team takes a deeper look into what's being done to protect elected officials.
A UC Davis survey shows 67% of Americans think political violence is a serious threat to our democracy. I'm back with our fact-check team. We have seen an increase in attacks, most recently, of course, the one against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. Connor, any measures being taken now to curb this violence?
Yeah, Eugene, we found that there's a few. We found that Congress passed a $1.9 billion emergency spending package last year to upgrade Capitol security. But more recently, the House Sergeant at Arms created a security program that launched in August, and it pays for up to $10,000 worth of security system equipment and installation costs at members' homes. Now, this is only for House members. We did reach out to the Senate side to hear if they had a similar program, but we didn't hear back.
Now, there is, of course, also Capitol Police. What are they doing? Any specific action there?
Right. So we spoke to them directly, and they said that for safety reasons, they don't discuss how security decisions are made, but they did tell us they're looking to hire roughly 280 officers this year. That's about double the amount they normally hire, and so far they're on track to do that.
Well, now, it turns out, Courtney, you found that some members are actually taking matters into their own hands, arranging for their own security.
It seems that way. Security concerns have actually grown so much that many members are dipping into their own official or campaign accounts to protect themselves. According to New York Times analysis of congressional data, since just last year, they've spent more than $6 million on security, with Democrats spending about $9,000 more on average than Republicans.
Can we break that down further? Do we know who's spending the most?
We have that data pulled up for you. You'll see that at the top is Senator Raphael Warnock, who is up for re-election. He spent over $600,000 last year. Senator Ted Cruz is second, and Senator Jon Ossoff is third. And after the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband, we looked into how much she spends on security, but we couldn't find any specific numbers likely for security concerns.
Sure. Good breakdown there, however. Thank you both for your work on this. The fact-check team will continue to follow developments on these and some other issues. And, of course, you can read this story with links to where they found their information on our website, thenationaldesk.com.
Straight ahead, an anti-Semitic message left in a college's Jewish student center. Plus, where students were shocked by a hateful note and how local leaders are reacting. The National Desk team of reporters bringing you the headlines from coast to coast, taking the pulse of America. We start in Rhode Island, where students at Brown University are concerned about an anti-Semitic note found on campus.
It's really scary that it's happening on my own college campus.
The Brown University Hillel Center brands itself as a safe space for members of the Jewish community.
I go every single week for Shabbat dinner.
But things took a turn over the weekend when a public safety officer found an anti-Semitic note in the center's reception area. Police say the note read, quote, "I would never give the rich, stuck-up, entitled Jews any money. Expletive you all, hail Hitler, gas the expletive Jews, and hope you die."
Brown is an institution founded on diversity and inclusion, and it's very disappointing to see that some students are not holding that sentiment towards the Jewish community here.
Rabbi Josh Bolton with the Hillel Center shared this statement with NBC 10 News. He wrote, "While BRH takes any expression of anti-Semitism very seriously, we will not allow an incident like this to divert our focus from our core mission of building a flourishing Jewish community."
In Maryland, Baltimore residents are worried about the safety of young people after 3 teenagers were shot in separate incidents last weekend. Baltimore police report a total of 70 teenage shooting victims so far this year. 16 of them lost their lives.
We need tougher penalties. We need serious action. We need people to be held responsible for their actions. We need consequences to be made. Those young people who have been killed and shot, it hurts my heart. Life is being taken left and right.
And police still looking for those responsible for the weekend shootings. In Nevada, Las Vegas police believe they may have solved a cold case murder from more than 40 years ago. Police arrested 64-year-old Paul Nuttall for the rape and murder of Sandra DeFelice after using new technology to test DNA found under the victim's fingernails. Those who know the suspect say they aren't entirely surprised by the arrest.
I wouldn't put it past him. He's always been a weird creature. I never wanted to be left in the same room with him by myself.
He was previously considered a person of interest in the case. Still to come, President Biden accusing oil companies of making big profits from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The action he's now threatening to get them to boost output.
Prices are the top issue on the minds of American families. It's the top issue for the president as well.
Tighter supply and fluctuating oil prices sending the price of gas on an upward climb. AAA reports the national average for a gallon of gas is around $3.80, matching the average from a month ago, but about 40 cents higher than 1 year ago. As the national desk Kayla Gaskin reports, some experts believe the White House has been taking the wrong approach to the fuel fight.
President Biden lashing out against oil companies.
Enough is enough.
Pointing to recent profits.
The outrageous profits they're making today.
Threatening a one-time windfall tax if they don't step up production to ease prices. Larry Summers, a top economic advisor to Presidents Clinton and Obama, warns such a tax could backfire, tweeting, quote, "If you reduce profitability, you will discourage investment, which is the opposite of our objective." With the clock ticking down to the midterms, high gas prices are not what Democrats want to see.
This president is laser focused. We're all incredibly laser focused on the tools we have to try to keep downward pressure on price.
Since Biden stepped into power, gas prices have risen nationally, peaking at more than $5 per gallon this summer. As of Tuesday, prices still well over $1 higher than Inauguration Day. The Biden administration accusing the energy giants of using the war in Ukraine for their own gain.
It's time for these companies to stop war profiteering.
But Frank Macchiarola from the American Petroleum Institute says Biden's White House had it wrong from the start.
They've talked about the need for more supply, but they've shut down access to federal lands and waters. They've talked about the need for permitting reform and more infrastructure, but they've canceled pipeline projects. They've talked about reducing costs, but they've proposed and passed tax increases on U.S. producers.
Even meeting with the Saudis didn't help. OPEC doing the exact opposite of what Biden wanted, sharply cutting oil production, with the Saudis now warning the coming months will be painful for the U.S. To make matters worse, the U.S. is facing a diesel fuel shortage, possibly affecting an already fragile supply chain and driving inflation even higher. In Washington, I'm Kayla Gaskins for the National Desk, America's News Now.
And as you just mentioned, Kayla, the U.S. diesel supply dangerously low with only enough fuel to last about 25 days. This week, our Eugene Ramirez sat down with the chief economist at the American Farm Bureau to discuss how the shortage could impact everyday Americans.
So farmers use diesel fuel, of course, for tractors and other heavy equipment and machinery for harvesting, of course, to transport their goods across the country as well. What are you hearing right now out on the fields about diesel concerns? Some farmers, I'm reading, are actually having to get creative to try and keep things on track at the farm.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. We're starting to see some rationing at different locations as they're trying to make sure that the fuel is in the location that makes the most sense for the providers, which means, yeah, of course, some of our farmers are having to travel a little bit longer distance in order to get the fuel that they need.
Now, consumers typically end up paying the price for just about anything affecting the supply chain. What do you think your farmers' concerns today are going to look like at the grocery store, say, a couple weeks or months from now?
Well, like consumers, farmers are price takers, which is exactly what you described. We end up basically paying for everything as well. So unfortunately, there isn't a lot of room for farmers to absorb those costs. So they end up getting passed on to consumers. So as we're looking at increased fuel costs, it's about 10% of an average operating cost for a farm under normal conditions. But when we're looking at diesel prices the way they are today, certainly looking at increased costs and therefore likely increased costs in the grocery stores.
Yeah, something people don't want to see, obviously. Let's take a look at what's behind all of this. Lots of finger pointing, as there is these days with just about everything. The White House largely pointing to the cutoff of Russian imports amid the invasion of Ukraine. There's a Forbes report that also echoes that, also adding that there's been a recent closing of several unprofitable refineries. I imagine you're looking into this as well. What's the Farm Bureau's assessment of what got us here?
Well, on the supply side, we'd largely agree. While Russia was only about 3% of U.S. crude oil imports, they're about 20% of petroleum product imports. And oftentimes those petroleum products from Russia in particular were used in refineries for diesel production. So on the supply side, would largely agree. I would also add that there's the fall and the winter tend to be high demand portions of the year for diesel consumption. So gasoline tends to be high in the summertime when consumers are out going on summer vacation, whereas diesel demand increases in the fall when retailers are trying to get goods on the shelf for the holiday season. Farmers are out in the field harvesting, and honestly, also increased fuel costs for home heating. Yep, those are all contributors that make it a lot stronger demand in the fall.
Makes sense. Quickly, I want to ask you a question. Elections around the corner, everybody talking about that, of course. Republicans want more domestic oil supply. Democrats pushing for renewable energy like biofuels, which I saw that the Farm Bureau listed on its 2023 bill priorities. How would biofuels impact the dependence on diesel, not only now, but years from now, if we move more towards that direction?
Well, we've long been supporters of biofuels as playing a significant role in the total fuel consumption in the United States. It helps extend gasoline and diesel usage, and certainly it has a lot of benefits on the environmental side as well. So, of course, increased biofuel production and usage would certainly go a long ways to increasing our fuel independency and not leave us as exposed to geopolitical exercises elsewhere.
Sure. Veronica and I, thanks so much. We appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And coming up, midterm elections just days away, but one state has not yet held primaries, where residents will be voting in primaries as midterm elections are being held. Taking a look at the top trending stories on our website right now, a Miami Chick-fil-A owner says he's found success with offering staff a 3-day, 14-hour work week. He says he's seen a 100% retention rate at the management level. The Drug Enforcement Agency said they had no evidence rainbow fentanyl was being hidden in Halloween candy to target kids. The issue became a talking point for some candidates as midterm elections near. Those stories and more available right now at thenationaldesk.com. Looking ahead to stories making headlines this week, Twitter employees reportedly have until Monday to make the platform's Blue subscription plan mandatory for verified users at new CEO Elon Musk's request or risk being fired. And on Tuesday, Louisiana voters will head to the polls voting in the state's primaries. Their votes may determine which candidates will occupy offices at all levels of the state's government or which candidates go on to a runoff. Coming up next, pushing for the removal of a popular app from the U.S. A government group taking issue with the way TikTok handles your data. You're watching The National Desk, America's News Now. You can catch us live weekdays from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. and 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Time. And anytime online at thenationaldesk.com. We'll be right back.
The National Desk, America's News Now.
This is the National Desk, America's News Now. I'm Dee Gatton. Some questions being raised about the government's role in fighting disinformation as the Biden administration has pledged to crack down on bad information from Russia and China and domestically. As the National Desk, Christine Frizzell reports, the concern is about who determines what constitutes disinformation.
New Twitter owner Elon Musk has vowed a platform with less content moderation and more free speech, with critics arguing it's already devolved to a platform where hate speech and conspiracy theories roam wild. But The Intercept is now reporting on what it calls truth cops, detailing leaked meeting notes from the federal government that show how, quote, tech platforms would be called upon to process reports and provide timely responses, to include the removal of reported misinformation from the platform where possible. A sign some say the Department of Homeland Security's mission to combat foreign disinformation has crept and come home.
Even if some false speech about these issues reduces trust in government and can therefore be seen to give aid and comfort to terrorists, quashing domestic information about these issues violates Americans' First Amendment rights.
There is also reporting on a special government reporting system for Facebook employees to use, a system lawmakers have criticized, along with the Biden administration's Disinformation Governance Board, which dissolved amid criticisms it was akin to a Big Brother or a Ministry of Truth.
How do you propose that you're going to have an office of disinformation governance if you see the problem in even determining what is disinformation?
But supporters of such systems say the federal government should be involved to protect U.S. national security, since many of the threats begin online but can evolve into violence that actually threatens people's lives. They cite last year's attack on the U.S. Capitol and the attack on Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband and threats against people and democracy.
We're seeing increases in voter intimidation efforts across the country. We've had threats to election officials and election officers consistently since the election in 2020.
The role of the U.S. government in countering those threats, both publicly and privately, prompting new questions in Washington. I'm Christine Frizzell reporting for the National Desk, America's News Now.
And Christine, new calls for the app TikTok to be banned in the U.S. A federal communications commissioner voiced concerns amid the popular platform's ties to China. Brendan Carr, who is one of the 5 people who leads the FCC, argues there is no way to have sufficient confidence that Americans' data on the app is not being sent back to Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. TikTok is owned by Chinese tech giant ByteDance. The company disputes that notion. New details this week concerning big hacks. The U.S. Treasury Department says banks spent more than $1 billion in ransomware-related payments last year. That's more than double the amount from 2020 and the most ever reported. The increase, however, could be attributed to banks getting better at tracking and reporting those payments. The Federal Trade Commission says the personal information of 40 million users has been exposed by a company offering homework help and other education technology services. The FTC is suing Chegg, demanding it put stronger safeguards on customer data. It comes after FTC officials say the company failed to address security weaknesses following 4 breaches in 2017, putting Social Security numbers, passwords, and other sensitive information at risk. Well, sweeping new changes to the federal student loan system. New regulations from the Department of Education include additional consumer protections for borrowers and limits on the amount of interest that can accrue on debt. The rules are scheduled to take effect in July. The department's overhaul of the federal student loan system comes as President Biden's student debt relief plan faces legal challenges. It might be until June before we get the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action. Justices are considering the constitutionality of colleges taking a student's race into account in admissions decisions. As the National Desk's Atra Elnishar explains, the practice used for decades to increase diversity has been banned in several states.
2 cases targeting affirmative action at Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill have been brought to the Supreme Court by the group Students for Fair Admissions, run by conservative activist Edward Bloom. Bloom's previously lost a case arguing race-conscious admissions harms white students. This time, his group argues it hurts Asian American students by favoring Black and Hispanic applicants. One complaint is they're being penalized by what's called a personal score rating,
which talks about, the personality, whether they're outgoing and have character and leadership qualities. And they're claiming that Asians are being scored lower on that rating than other racial groups.
Vice Dean of Rutgers Law School, Stacey Hawkins, says opponents of affirmative action have a clear strategy in targeting Harvard. In the late 70s, the court said the school's affirmative action didn't violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
Harvard was the one that was named as the model, and if we can strike down the Harvard plan, then obviously every plan falls as a consequence.
Lower courts have ruled in the school's favor as of now, pointing to Supreme Court precedent of criteria for considering an applicant's race.
The first is that they articulate some compelling interest. The second criterion is that they have to use race, right, no greater than necessary to achieve that interest, right? It has to be necessary.
Supporters of affirmative action hope the court looks at what's happened in states where it's banned. In the mid-1990s, California banned consideration of race and gender in public education. Soon after, the number of Black and Latino students at UC schools plunged. In an amicus brief supporting Harvard and UNC, the president and chancellors of the UC system write, quote, simple mathematics dictate that African American and Native American students will often be the only student of their race in their courses. Schools all over the country watching the pending decision closely from a court that lately hasn't shied away from overturning precedent. In Washington, I'm Atrell Nashar for the National Desk, America's News Now.
Antra, thank you. The assistant football coach at a Washington State high school who was sidelined after praying on the field is getting his job back. Our Jan Jeffcoat sat down with Coach Joe Kennedy and his attorney to discuss his big win on a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Coach Kennedy, you're expected to be reinstated as assistant coach by the spring of next year at Bremerton High School. How do you feel after this multi-year legal battle?
It feels so good. It's beyond anything I could really describe. After such a long battle, I just want to be back on the football field with my guys.
And Attorney Dice, I want to talk about the U.S. Supreme Court because they sided with Kennedy in June, ruling 6-3 in his favor. Tell us what the Supreme Court said in their ruling. What are the terms of this decision? And tell us what this means for future court cases.
Yeah, this is an enormous decision, not only for Coach Kennedy, but for all of those coaches and teachers of faith that go onto our school campuses every single day. That the Supreme Court said in June that, school districts have to respect people of faith that exercise their religion, whether that's outside the schoolhouse gates or when they walk through them. No longer are school boards allowed to require our teachers and coaches to leave their faith behind them in the parking lot. They can walk through the schoolhouse gates. And especially the Supreme Court was concerned with reminding our school districts that they have to tolerate in a diverse society these religious beliefs that come on campus here. And so people of faith should not be fired from their jobs simply because they've engaged in their faith while on campus here. That the free exercise clause of our First Amendment actually means something, and it's very important in our society that allows people of faith to walk in every category of society, including when they walk on the football field. So I'd encourage folks that have questions about this decision to go to firstliberty.org to learn more about their rights.
And Jeremy, is he entitled right now to all the back pay? Because he's been out of a job for how long right now?
It's been almost 7 or almost 8 football seasons, I guess now. Look, this was never about the money. I think he made like $9 an hour, or 9 cents an hour rather, coaching football. So it wasn't ever that. He had never even asked for money. He only asked for 2 things. Just put him back on the football field, get his job back. And when he's back on that football field, to be able to take a knee in private prayer for 15 or 30 seconds. That's all he's ever asked for. That's all he's ever wanted. And by March 15 of 2023, that's what he's going to get.
Yeah, and Coach, what has life been like for you the past 7 or 8 years? How have you been able to make ends meet since you lost your job?
Well, I was employed, and I definitely had other sources of income. The whole thing with working for the school district was my passion. Just being able to go out there with the guys and teach these young men, that was my calling, and that's what I enjoyed.
Yeah, and to be clear, you would go after the games and you would pray on the 50-yard line, and your players would come and join you. That was their choice.
Yeah, sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't, but I ceased that practice as soon as the school district told me to stop praying with the kids.
Coach, what's your message to anyone else who feels like they are hopeless when it comes to perhaps expressing their freedom of religion or freedom of speech? What is your message to them this morning?
Definitely just stand strong. And the Constitution is worth fighting for, and if people don't stand up and fight, then they'll end up losing their constitutional right. So be brave, be strong, and the fight is very much worth it.
And since the Supreme Court decision and your job reinstatement, can you update us on what's the latest here?
as far as the school district in Birmingham, I know they're working very hard at getting ready to go to the playoffs. So we'll work out the details with them as soon as the season's over.
All right. Coach Kennedy and Attorney Jeremy Dice, we certainly appreciate you both joining us this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Have a great week.
As voters head to the polls, some will decide if they want term limits for certain elected leaders. Advocates say it would help them stay in touch with their constituents. Our fact-check team looked into the issue.
Tonight, we're looking into term limits at the federal, state, and at the local level. I'm back with the fact-check team now, and I want to start with the upcoming midterm elections. Courtney, in fact, there are some term limits on the ballots.
There are in a few places like Baltimore, California, Florida, North Dakota, and Michigan.
Yeah, now let's look at the federal level. Give us the facts. What are the current term limits there?
Federal term limits only exist for the executive branch or the president, the limit being 2 four-year terms. Congress passed this into law with the 22nd Amendment in 1947 after FDR served 4 consecutive terms. Meanwhile, we learned that the vice president can serve unlimited 4-year terms, House members can serve unlimited 2-year terms, senators unlimited 6-year terms, and Supreme Court justices have no limits at all.
Now, interestingly, and some people might not know this, but Congress did have limits, though briefly.
Right. We looked into that, and in 1990, term limit advocates worked to impose limits on members of Congress by changing state laws, amending state constitutions, and passing state ballot initiatives. By 1995, 23 states passed term limit laws, but the Supreme Court ruled that same year that it was unconstitutional.
Okay, let's look at the states now. Janae, do those exist, the limits there?
They do, Eugene. So if you take a look at your screens, you'll see that there are currently 15 states that have them, including Maine, California, Michigan, and Florida. Now, we found that in total, 21 states have passed term limits at one point in time, but the limits have been repealed or declared unconstitutional, and 6 of them. In terms of gubernatorial term limits, 36 states have some type of limit, and there are a dozen states that have no term limits at all, including Wisconsin, Texas, and New York, while New Hampshire and Vermont are the only states that have unlimited 2-year terms instead of the 4-year terms in other states.
All right, lots of different rules there. What can you tell us about the local level limits?
So we found something really interesting. So 9 of the 10 largest cities in the U.S. have term limits, including New York, Los Angeles, and Houston. These include limits on mayor and city council members, but they are the outliers. So according to an International City County Management Association report, over 91% of U.S. municipalities have no term limits for mayor or city council.
Interesting number there. Thank you, ladies, for your work on this, and the fact-check team will continue to follow developments on these and other issues. You can read this story with links to where they found their information on our website. Head on over to thenationaldesk.com.
And coming up, $30,000 worth of stolen goods recovered. How police track down the merchandise and their messages to the thieves. The National Desk team of reporters is bringing you the headlines from coast to coast. We're taking the pulse of America, starting in California, where police busted a massive theft ring.
CHP and Fresno police officers had a productive day knocking on doors and serving search warrants. At this home in Kawa, they hit the jackpot.
When we arrive with search warrants, they're typically surprised, but it's a good surprise for our outcome.
At the 3 locations where officers made arrests, they recovered more than $30,000 of stolen goods from local retailers. Clothing, footwear, and beauty supplies were taken from Victoria's Secret, Kohl's, Boot Barn, Tilly's, and Ulta Beauty. Salas says this is only the beginning for the CHP's Organized Retail Crimes Task Force.
The Highway Patrol cares, local law enforcement cares. We want to send out the message that you will be caught. We are looking for you.
This Academy statuette was donated months ago and almost was thrown in the trash until the people here at the thrift store found out it was actually worth something.
And when I had found some information online about an auction that one of these pieces was auctioned off about 10 years ago, it went for about $13,000. But, you know, I always want to verify things I'm reading, so I decided to go straight to the source.
That source, a worker at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures. A few photos and half a dozen emails later, the true identity behind the 87-year-old statuette was unveiled.
It is a statuette from the 1935 Academy Awards, and it is the year that Clark Gable in the film It Happened One Night. It was the first film that swept all 5 major motion picture categories.
Columbia Pictures made the mini statues for executives and stars in the movie to celebrate the win.
He is in an area where they are experiencing active shelling. He's in a shelter for dogs and cats right now, which isn't ideal for a monkey.
Crystal Mathis, executive director of the 78-acre facility, says what would be ideal is for Harry to be relocated to primarily Primates, a wildlife sanctuary in northern Bexar County. Harry, who's 4, could spend the final 25 or more years of his life with friends like Harley. Mathis is currently working with other groups to make that happen.
I think that Harry would be a really good addition to the families of vervets that we have here.
It won't be cheap to get Harry out of Ukraine, check for diseases, and delivered to San Antonio.
A guesstimate would be maybe about $25,000.
Staffers assess the personality of all newcomers to determine where to place them.
But it's kind of like a monkey soap opera around here. We're always having to see how the social hierarchies are.
After that, the primates will be allowed to monkey around to their heart's content.
I wonder if he chatters in an accent, if they'll be able to understand each other.
Sweet Harry. Still to come, our Washington, D.C. Bureau correspondents break down this week in Washington, diving into some of the neck-and-neck midterm races across the country.
Our Washington Bureau covers Capitol Hill and D.C. every day to report on the important issues facing the country and how they impact you. For some perspective on what's happening in the nation's capital and on the campaign trail, I'm joined by Chief Political Correspondent Scott Thuman. Scott, Election Day on Tuesday, and by all accounts, Republicans are seeing the momentum in their effort to take control of Congress from the Democrats. How are things shaping up in the final days?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing a tightening in some races that perhaps a couple of months ago, Steve, might not have been predicted, especially in places out like Nevada, where this has been seen as a solidly blue seat for Catherine Cortez Masto. Suddenly, Adam Laxalt making some moves there that have Democrats concerned enough that in places like Nevada, like New Mexico, even up in Washington State, you're seeing a little more resources put into this by Democrats who want to make sure, for example, in this case, that Patty Murray holds that seat she's had for 30 years. A little bit of a challenge now from Tiffany Smiley. And you look to the East Coast a little bit. We've talked a ton about Pennsylvania, so we don't need to go into that anymore. But how about New Hampshire? Now, this is a seat that Maggie Hassan, the senator, the incumbent Democrat, has had. It seemed to be very safe territory. May still be after election night, but right now Don Bolduc giving a little bit of a run for her money in that particular case. And so now you start to see Democrats campaigning and pouring money into states that they probably didn't think they'd have to at this stage.
Yeah, and high-profile Democrats, as well as some of the party's candidates, are bracing for a tough day on Tuesday. Is it too late for Democrats to turn this thing around?
You know, I mean, less than a week out, it would appear so. That's if, of course, you trust the polls. And remember, a lot of people trusted the polls in 2016 and woke up to find very different headlines than they may have written the day before. So we have to see. But when it comes to messaging, and we've talked a lot about this, Steve, abortion rights, threats to democracy, these were issues that Democrats really campaigned hard on. But all of the polling continued to show that it was the economy that mattered most. And when you look at a lot of the House races across the country, you know, there are maybe 35 within these states that we've been keeping close eyes on that are considered toss-ups right now. And some of the latest data has shown that if Republicans of the toss-ups pick up anywhere between 3 and 6 of those seats, they have the majority, everything else would be a bonus. So right now, it looks like that red wave is strong enough that Republicans may be feeling pretty good. But again, election night predictions aren't always the case, as we saw just 6 years ago. What's interesting, Steve, is how Republicans are now contesting in areas that have been pretty blue for a long time, harping on the economy and crime.
And quickly, in the final week, we've seen the president on the road, but in some curious places, right? I mean, he's going to places that aren't necessarily battlegrounds. Why is that?
Well, sure. I mean, New California, over on the East Coast, New York. We saw Vice President Harris and former presidential nominee Hillary Clinton there this week, excuse me. It's all because they're seeing those races start to teeter a little bit. And so it's unusual to see this kind of move this late in the game. Normally it would be Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, the traditional stomping grounds where they know they just want to get their candidate across the finish line. Right now they're playing a lot of defense in those states.
Yeah, Chief Political Correspondent Scott Thuman, thank you. Dee Dee, back to you.
Thanks, guys. Women leaving leadership roles, the increasing challenges women face in the workplace, driving them to clock out for good. Women in senior management positions are already in short supply. Now, a new report suggests women in senior leadership roles are leaving their jobs at higher rates than men. The National Desk's Angelo looks into the factors leading them to step away.
Female leaders are making it all the way to the top and then walking away from leadership roles. A new report surveyed over 300 companies, interviewing over 40,000 employees. While on one hand it's true, more women are breaking the glass ceiling in corporate America.
There's this pipeline of women coming into the workforce, and it's only going to get bigger, and they will find their way to the top.
But many female leaders who are punching through are now punching out. Here's the big number from this new report from McKinsey & Company and LeadIn.org. About 10.5% of female leaders in senior management roles and above left their company in 2021. Compared with 9% of male leaders. That number matters because there are fewer women in leadership roles. CEO Melissa Simpkins works to empower women in the workforce.
The challenges women are facing as they progress, parenting, taking care of aging parents, dealing with spouses, dealing with the community, their aging parents. It's a lot. Yeah. And so that weight and that pressure is not really been addressed in corporate America.
Imbalances at home and the office. The report says female leaders are facing headwinds trying to advance, including experiencing more belittling microaggressions, such as having their judgment questioned, while doing more to support employee well-being, leaving them overworked for efforts often overlooked. Career specialist Julie Balke says female leaders just want a better work culture.
They're looking for flexibility, a healthy work culture, and DEI, diversity and inclusion efforts.
To put all of this in perspective, the report found that for every woman at the director level who gets promoted to the next level, 2 female directors are choosing to leave their company. In Washington, D.C., I'm Angela Brown.
Angela, thank you. Another new report shows U.S. workers are a lot less productive this year. Productivity plunged in the first half of the year by the sharpest rate on record going back to 1947. The Bureau of Labor Statistics defines productivity as how much goods and services an employee can produce in an hour. Experts say when productivity slows, economic growth dwindles. That'll be all for us on the weekend edition of the National Desk, America's News Now. Don't forget, you can catch us live from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. and 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Time. Just check your local listings. You can also watch us online and catch up with the latest headlines on thenationaldesk.com. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great weekend.